What would you do if you saw a young boy walking to school in his sister's torn dress? Would you look away? Would you judge? Or would you stop and ask why? In a small town in Ohio, one millionaire did exactly that, and what he discovered didn't just change one child's life. It exposed a hidden crisis affecting thousands of families across America, and sparked a movement that's still growing today. This is the true story of how a single moment of courage turned tragedy into hope, and why what happened next will restore your faith in humanity. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in November when Richard Coleman pulled his Mercedes into a gas station on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. Richard wasn't your typical millionaire. He'd grown up poor, built his fortune from nothing, and never forgot where he came from. But even with his background, what he saw that morning stopped him cold. Walking along the shoulder of the highway, shivering in the early morning frost, was a boy who couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He was wearing a pink, flower-patterned dress that was 2 sizes too small, torn at the hem, and completely inadequate for the bitter cold. Richard's first instinct was disbelief. Then concern. Then action. He pulled his car over, got out, and approached the boy carefully. The child's name was Michael, and he was walking 3 miles to reach his elementary school. His feet were wrapped in plastic bags inside sneakers held together with duct tape. His hands were red and cracked from the cold. When Richard asked him about the dress, Michael's answer was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd normalized his own suffering. "My sister outgrew it, and we don't have money for boy clothes right now. My mom says it's fine because it keeps me warm enough." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Richard later described feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Here was a child, in one of the wealthiest countries on earth, wearing his sister's torn clothing because his family couldn't afford the basics. Richard asked Michael if he could drive him to school, and during that 15-minute car ride, he learned the truth about a crisis hiding in plain sight. Michael's father had died 2 years earlier from untreated diabetes. His mother worked 2 jobs but still couldn't cover rent, food, and clothing for 3 children. They'd been evicted twice in the past year. Michael wore the dress because his little sister had gotten new clothes from a church donation drive, and when she outgrew them, nothing could go to waste. What Richard discovered that morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem that most of us never see. According to the National Center for Children in Poverty, over 13 million children in the United States live below the federal poverty line. That's nearly 1 in 5 kids. But here's what's even more staggering: millions more live in families that earn just above that line, trapped in what economists call the working poor. These are families where parents work full-time jobs, sometimes multiple jobs, and still can't afford basic necessities. When Richard began investigating, he found stories that broke his heart. There was 7-year-old Emma, who wore the same pair of pants to school every single day for an entire year because they were the only ones that fit. There was 12-year-old David, who stopped going to school altogether because kids bullied him mercilessly for wearing shoes with holes in them. There was 10-year-old Sophia, who learned to sew at age 8 so she could repair her own clothes because her family couldn't afford replacements. These weren't children in some distant developing nation. These were American kids, living in our communities, sitting in classrooms next to children who had everything they needed. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that children living in poverty face chronic stress that affects their brain development, academic performance, and long-term health outcomes. But perhaps the most damaging effect is invisible: shame. Children who can't afford proper clothing learn to internalize their poverty as a personal failure. They develop anxiety, depression, and a belief that they're somehow less worthy than their peers. Michael told Richard something during that car ride that haunted him for weeks afterward. "I try to get to school really early," Michael said, "so I can get to my classroom before the other kids see what I'm wearing. Sometimes I hide in the bathroom until the bell rings." Richard couldn't unhear those words. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Michael shivering in that torn dress, about all the other children suffering in silence, about the profound injustice of a system that allowed this to happen. By 3 in the morning, he'd made a decision. He was going to do something about it. Not a one-time donation. Not a feel-good gesture. Something systematic, sustainable, and scalable. Within a week, Richard had established the Dignity First Foundation. His mission was simple but ambitious: ensure that every child in his community had access to appropriate, well-fitting clothing regardless of their family's financial situation. He started by partnering with local schools to identify families in need, creating a system where requests could be made privately and without judgment. He worked with clothing manufacturers to secure bulk orders at cost. He recruited volunteers to sort, organize, and distribute items. And he invested $2 million of his own money to get it off the ground. But Richard understood something crucial that many charitable efforts miss: dignity matters as much as aid. He didn't want to create a system where poor children received obviously second-hand or mismatched clothing that would mark them as charity cases. Instead, he ensured that children received new, quality clothing that looked no different from what their peers wore. There were no logos, no labels, no visible markers that screamed "donated." He created a private online portal where parents could select items just like they would from any retail website. The clothes were delivered in plain packaging directly to their homes. The entire process was designed to preserve dignity while meeting need. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, the foundation had helped over 200 children. By the end of the first year, that number had grown to over 3,000. Parents sent letters describing how their children's confidence had transformed. Teachers reported improved attendance and academic performance. Counselors noted decreased anxiety and behavioral issues. One mother wrote, "You gave my daughter more than clothes. You gave her the ability to walk into school with her head held high. You gave her the chance to just be a kid, without the weight of our financial struggles on her shoulders. You gave her dignity." But the story doesn't end there. Because what started as one man's response to seeing one child in need became something far bigger. News of Richard's foundation spread across social media, catching the attention of journalists, celebrities, and most importantly, other communities facing the same crisis. Within 2 years, similar programs had been established in 37 states. Corporations began partnering with the foundation, contributing not just funding but expertise in logistics and distribution. Schools across the country adopted the Dignity First model, training staff to identify and assist struggling families without stigma. Michael, the boy in the torn dress, is now 14 years old. He's an honor roll student, captain of his school's debate team, and a volunteer with the very foundation that helped him. In a video interview conducted last year, he said something profound: "Mr. Coleman didn't just give me clothes that day. He gave me the message that I mattered. That my struggle was seen. That I deserved better. And that changed everything about how I saw myself and what I believed I could become." The foundation has now helped over 50,000 children and their families. But Richard insists that the numbers aren't the real story. The real story is in the moments: the little girl who raised her hand in class for the first time because she wasn't worried about her classmates noticing her worn-out clothes. The boy who tried out for the basketball team because he finally had proper athletic shoes. The teenager who went to prom because someone made sure she had a beautiful dress. Each moment represents a child who was given the chance to just be a child, free from the burden of poverty that they never asked for and couldn't control. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the society we've built. How have we created a system where working parents can't afford to clothe their children? Why do we accept child poverty as an inevitable reality rather than a solvable crisis? And what responsibility do those of us with resources have to those without? Richard often says that the morning he met Michael was the morning he truly understood his purpose. "I'd spent decades building wealth," he explains, "but I'd never felt genuinely wealthy until I understood that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve something beyond yourself." That boy in the torn dress gave me more than I ever gave him. He gave me meaning. The Dignity First Foundation has inspired a broader movement examining how we approach childhood poverty. Policymakers have begun discussing clothing assistance as a component of educational support. Schools are training teachers to recognize signs of family hardship. Communities are creating resource networks that connect struggling families with help before crisis hits. The conversation has shifted from treating poverty as a personal failure to recognizing it as a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. Every day, children across this country are walking to school carrying burdens they shouldn't have to bear. They're sitting in classrooms wondering if anyone notices their struggle, if anyone cares, if anything will ever change. Richard Coleman's story proves that one person noticing, one person caring, one person taking action can spark transformation that ripples far beyond what we can imagine. So here's my challenge to you: what would you do if you saw a child like Michael? More importantly, what will you do now that you know children like Michael exist in every community, including yours? Maybe you can't start a foundation, but you can volunteer at a local shelter. You can donate to clothing drives. You can advocate for policies that support struggling families. You can choose to see the invisible and refuse to look away. Because every child deserves dignity. Every child deserves to walk into school with confidence. Every child deserves to just be a child. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected with stories that matter. Drop a comment below telling us about acts of kindness you've witnessed or participated in. And remember, we all have the power to change someone's world. Sometimes it starts with simply asking why.